It is as a trustbuster, along with a conservationist, that TR is perhaps most historically significant. Remember, by the end of the 19th century, the sense of economic inequality that accompanied the economic explosion after the Civil War had become pervasive. One man symbolized it, that was J.P. Morgan. The largest company in the United States was U.S. Steel. It was the first billion-dollar corporation. It was the creation of J.P. Morgan. That one company, its assets were equal to 7% of the nation's gross national product. And that was just one of J.P. Morgan's economic creations. He had many others. Well, in 1902, without any warning, TR did something no president before him would have dared think about doing. He involved the federal government in the courts in an effort to break up a trust, the Northern Securities Company, which was a holding company for railroads in the Pacific Northwest. He summoned Morgan to the White House for a confrontation. And Morgan, of course, thought that the rules were what they'd always been. If we have done anything wrong, he said to the president, send your man to my man, and they can fix it up. That can't be done, said TR. TR's attorney general piped in, we don't want to fix it up, we want to stop it. And that's exactly what they did. 44 antitrust actions were filed during the Roosevelt presidency. Toward the end of his tenure, he was no longer the conservative reformer. He was becoming increasingly a convinced, confirmed radical, if you will. Not only in his use of presidential power, he agitated a revolution in Panama because he wanted a canal. The French had failed, the United States would not fail. And when Colombia reneged on the deal that he thought they had, he then authorized a revolution, a very conveniently timed revolution, in Panama. And the new government of Panama, which he instantly recognized, was much more cooperative than the old government of Colombia. The Great White Fleet, remember? TR wants to project American power onto the global scene. The Great White Fleet did exactly that. 26 warships sent off on a round-the-world trip. There was only one problem. No one had paid for it. He did it on his own. But he understood. There was enough money to send the Great White Fleet halfway around the world. Congress wasn't going to leave it in Australia. They would have to pay for it to come back. Just as he had once said, I took the canal zone and let Congress debate, and while the debate goes on, so does the canal. Eventually, as you can imagine, there was going to be a reaction. He is today a patron saint for moderate Republicans. He was not seen as a moderate in 1908, 1909, as his term wound down. By the time of his final message, annual message to Congress, he was calling for not regulation, he was calling for government control of railroads, workmen's compensation, an 8-hour working day for government employees, inheritance and income taxes, an end to court injunctions against striking workers, and still more centralization of power in the presidency. Well, you can see he's on his way to the Bull Moose campaign of 1912 and the tragedy of his last years. He knew how to use power. He didn't know how to adapt to powerlessness. And his last years were not happy ones. In 1912, he split the Republican Party. He came in ahead of William Howard Taft. He had that satisfaction. Taft carried 2 states, Vermont and Utah, 8 electoral votes. TR did better than any third-party candidate in American history. But it wasn't enough because they elected Woodrow Wilson, who he hated even more than Taft. He referred to Wilson as a Byzantine logothete. Wilson responded by saying, why waste perfectly serviceable indignation on him? They hated each other. That we'll talk about a little bit tomorrow. In 1916, his Bull Moose party came back and said, we'll nominate you a second time. By that time, he basically discarded it. He'd used it. He tossed it away. He said he's only interested in running for president in 1916 on one condition: if the American people were in a mood to act heroically. Well, they weren't. Although in a few months they found themselves called upon to act heroically when Woodrow Wilson led us into World War I. TR, of course, immediately wanted to go to war. He was willing to humble himself and almost beg Wilson for permission to form a latter-day version of the Rough Riders. He went to the White House. He saw Wilson. Wilson afterwards, he couldn't resist it. He hated him, and yet he was charmed. He said, "I can see why people love the man. He is like a great, big, lovable boy." And there was that aspect of Tiara that in many ways never grew up. His life was an adventure story. But, of course, Wilson had run on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." He kept TR out of war. He refused to give him what he wanted. TR complained, "I'm the only person he kept out of war." And then, of course, the real tragedy in the fall of 1918, his youngest son, beloved Quentin, all the Roosevelt boys, by the way, enlisted, and they all fought overseas. Quentin was shot down and killed over France. And by that time, his father's health was deteriorating. He had gone off, typically. Right after leaving the White House, he'd gone on African safari. His opponents in the Republican Senate raised a toast to the lions. Well, he survived that trip, but he almost didn't survive the trip down the River of Doubt in Brazil. He said, "I have one more adventure in me." And he very nearly died. He lost 60 pounds through dysentery. But, he came through it. And ironically, life came full circle. Everyone believed that he would be the Republican candidate for president in 1920. The old rupture had healed, and the conservatives, the liberals, they all agreed. They hated Wilson enough, and they were willing to embrace TR. And think of what American history, how it might have been different in the 1920s if Theodore Roosevelt, instead of Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge, had been president. He was in the hospital for his 60th birthday. He told his sister now it didn't matter if he died because he had honored the pledge that he'd made as a young man. And she said, "What do you mean?" He said, "As a young man, I promised myself that I would live life to the hilt every day until I was 60. And if I'd done that, then it wouldn't matter how long I lived beyond." He went back to Sagamore Hill for Christmas. And on the night of January 5th, he told his wife, Edith, "You'll never know how much I love Sagamore Hill." He went to his bedroom. He told his valet, "Please put out the light." And they were his last words. He died in the middle of the night of an embolism in his lung. His son, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., sent a wire to his brothers that simply said, "The old lion is dead." And there was no state funeral. There was a simple service in the Dutch Reformed Church in Oyster Bay. And then they took the casket up the hill. And after everyone had left and they were preparing to lower the casket, they noticed one man who had remained behind with tears streaming down his face. It was William Howard Taft, who had been TR's closest friend, his bitterest enemy. And then finally, at the end of their life, they had managed a rapprochement, and they came together. The legacy of TR, of course, is of a presidency transformed. The bully pulpit works when the perfect occasion arises. If you think of race in the 20th century, if you think of the Cold War, you can think of memorable presidential appeals. The danger, of course, is that the bully pulpit comes to be trivialized, that every presidential announcement is treated as something worthy of a pulpit. A pulpit is a place for moral leadership. I'm not sure the federal budget should be announced from the pulpit. And the other, of course, the curse of Theodore Roosevelt is there was only one Theodore Roosevelt. Presidents who aren't as colorful, who aren't as flamboyant, who aren't as eloquent, who aren't as skillful at framing issues to galvanize the public, they operate at a disadvantage. TR changed forever our idea of what a successful, assertive president ought to be.